Morning. Hi, I'm Jeff Chelsky from the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank, and you are at the session on IMF collaboration with the World Bank on climate issues, the IEO evaluation. Let me start off by introducing our presenter and our panelists. Michael Kell is joining us from the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF, where he has been working since January 2019 and where he's led evaluations on IMF collaboration with the World Bank and IMF capacity development. Prior to that, Michael was chief economist and a value for money director at the UK National Audit Office for 9 years. He's held senior positions as an economist in the UK government and at the IMF, and a whole bunch of other very impressive things. We've got two panelists from the World Bank. We've got Bernice van Bronkhorst, who joined the World Bank in 2005 as an urban specialist in the Latin American and Caribbean region. She's since held various positions, including as sector or practice manager in the Disaster Risk Management and Climate Change Unit in the South Asia region, and most recently as practice manager for urban development and disaster risk management for East and Southern Africa in the Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience GP. We like long names at the World Bank. And at present, she's Global Director for Climate Change, where she oversees strategic priorities and implementation of the bank's Climate Change Action Plan. And our second panelist is James Roaf, who is Assistant Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. He's recently taken on the new role of Climate Change Policy Coordinator, overseeing a team of dedicated experts and rapidly expanding work agenda on fiscal policies to address climate change. Previously, he had IMF assignments as mission chief for Russia and Serbia, and worked on a whole host of crisis countries. And so with that, let me turn it over to Michael to present the findings of their preliminary evaluation.
Thank you, Jeff. So if I could have the second slide up, please. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the evaluation with the nice cover on the right-hand side there, which we actually finished in March, and we're just about to send to the IMF board when the world suddenly changed. So the IMF board consideration and actual publication of our evaluation is on hold, and we hope to get that through the board in November. I'm just checking because I've lost my screen now. Twinkle, I don't know if you can put the slides back up. Is that possible? No, let me make sure I can see them on my screen. Just a moment.
Mike, I can see them. So maybe I had to click on slide share, but I can actually see it.
Okay. I don't have that as an option. Anyway, let me. I can talk to the slides over here, so that's okay. So it's an evaluation of one kind of subset of IMF collaboration with the World Bank and some other organizations, specifically on a set of macro structural issues, which I'll explain a bit more in a moment. And the aim is to draw lessons for how the fund can work better with the bank and other partners. It's not intended as a comprehensive evaluation of all aspects of bank-fund collaboration. It's not an evaluation of the quality and impact of the IMF's work on macro structural issues. And it's certainly not an evaluation of the bank. The IEO's remit is strictly and purely looking at the fund. But obviously in this case, we did consult with the bank and get evidence from the bank. So if I could have the next slide, please. So a couple of slides of takeaways from the evaluation. Firstly, 4 points on the substance of what we found about collaboration by the fund. So collaboration can bring benefits, but it's also can be difficult and costly, and it's certainly not a panacea for addressing resource constraints. And I'll come back to explain, why that was a particular concern as I go through the slides. Secondly, we think the fund should systematically identify those areas, as in policy areas, where collaboration is likely to bring the greatest returns. And thirdly, in those areas where collaboration does look likely to bring significant net benefits, then we think it's worth the fund seriously considering developing tailored collaboration frameworks to put some structure around the collaboration. And those frameworks needed to be grounded in a good understanding of the business needs and indeed the constraints, particularly on the other party with which the fund is trying to work. And then fourthly, it's important that the fund can't really wholly delegate expertise on a particular issue to another organization. I think that would probably create too much risk for the fund in terms of the quality and its reputation. So the fund needs to explicitly consider how much resource it needs to put into an area where it's actively collaborating, both to facilitate the collaboration and also, as I say, to manage the quality risks. Next slide, please. This second set of takeaways relate more to one of the themes of the evaluation week, which is how evaluators can influence the strategic direction of the organization that they're evaluating. And I've highlighted 4 lessons that I think the IAO would emphasize in terms of maximizing influence. The first is around the timing of the work. The IAO always thinks quite hard about how the timing of its publication of its reports may or could fit into a cycle of strategic reviews that the IMF has in place. And I guess the IAO is quite fortunate in that the IMF does follow on the whole a fairly predictable timetable for reviews of various aspects of its operations. In this instance, there was going to be towards the end of 2020. In practice, it's been delayed, but our evaluation was timed to feed into the IMF's regular comprehensive surveillance reviews, which come around every 3 or 4 years. And as I say, there was one due towards the end of this year, and our evaluation was timed to feed into that, to speak to the collaboration aspects of the review of surveillance that the fund was to be doing. Second issue, I guess it's more of a question to consider rather than a clear lesson. But I think there is a trade-off, or there can potentially be a trade-off between the rigor and breadth of an evaluation and its timeliness. So this evaluation that I'm talking about today is actually the first of an IAO pilot approach where we produce the evaluation significantly faster than we typically do. So in IAO terms, that means this evaluation was essentially done in a year, whereas most of our evaluations take 2 years. And clearly that's going to entail some reduction in the depth and breadth compared to a regular evaluation, but bringing the advantage that we can move a bit quicker and time the publication to hopefully, as I say, feed into other review processes within the organization. And I think there's some potential to, in a sense, for a shorter evaluation to borrow hopefully some of the credibility that the IAO has built up through its regular, full, longer-term evaluations. So I think that's a consideration to bear in mind. Third point is around the importance of engagement with, in this instance, IMF staff to really hone the recommendations and make sure, firstly, that it's completely clear to IMF staff, the people who are hopefully going to be responding to the recommendations, that they understand exactly what it is that we're getting at, and that to the extent that we can adapt those recommendations to in certain ways to make it more likely that they will be appealing and helpful to the IMF, then I think that is time well spent. And then the fourth point is about the importance of outreach, that needs to be planned and properly resourced. And especially in the case of this evaluation, where we're not only looking to influence the fund, but potentially also to engage with and influence the World Bank. So we need to make sure that we go about that in an organised and hopefully effective way. Next slide, please, and the one after that. So I'm going to give you some of the background to the evaluation. There's a long history of attempts to improve collaboration between the bank and the fund, written into the Articles of Agreement that were established when both institutions were set up just after World War II. There are stipulations about cooperating with each other and indeed other external organizations. We counted at least 25 formalized agreements between the bank and the fund over the many years that the two organizations have been in existence. And just to give you a sense of what those different agreements relate to, we thought they broadly fell into 4 types. So the earliest agreements dating back to the 1940s tended to focus more on the modalities of information sharing between the two organizations. From the 1960s, as the membership of both organizations grew, there was more focus in the collaboration agreements on demarcating areas of responsibility and making sure there was clarity and shared understanding on that. And then from the late 1980s, the focus of the agreements tended to shift more onto complementarity rather than purely demarcation of responsibilities. And that's exemplified by the 1989 Concordat, which is still the formal framework that governs engagement between the bank and the fund, which was revisited in the late 2000s with a review and joint action plan between the bank and the fund. And then also in parallel, in the last 20 years or so, there's been an emphasis on collaboration frameworks that focus on specific issues, and HIPIC and financial sector assessments and surveillance, which are both kind of joint bank fund activities, would be examples of those specific frameworks around particular issues where there needs to be collaboration. Next slide, please. So just to give a bit of explanation of what we mean by macro-structural issues. So the fund there, I've given the definition of how the fund considers structural issues, which for the economists amongst you is essentially microeconomics. So it's impediments to the efficient production of goods and services and the efficient allocation of resources. And then those micro issues are considered macro critical if they affect or have the potential to affect domestic or external stability, including global stability, which is clearly a pretty wide definition for which structural issues are going to be considered macro critical. And leaving lots of room for, I guess, flexibility on the part of particular IMF teams to decide which of the structural issues facing an economy are macro critical and therefore important for the fund to look at. The fund has a long history of looking at some structural issues that's ebbed and flowed over the years. The attention focused after the global financial crisis in 2009, when there was a recognized need to focus on macro-structural reforms to enhance long-term growth, and also increasing attention, which the fund joined in with, looking at equity and inclusion issues. Next slide, please. So this gives the background to the fund's framework that it uses to guide staff on when to collaborate on macro-structural issues. It's a very simple 2x2 matrix. So the fund staff need to decide whether an issue is potentially macro critical or not. If it is, and there's IMF expertise, then that's clearly an issue that the fund will cover and will rely on in-house expertise. If it's a macro critical issue where the fund is considered not to have sufficient expertise, then that's where it's encouraged. The teams are encouraged to seek external input from the bank or possibly from academia or other international organizations. And then around the same time, the fund introduced 4 pilot schemes to use as a vehicle to explore the best ways to work on these macro-structural issues that it decided it wanted to focus on. There were 3 launched in 2014, excuse me, looking at inequality, gender, and climate and energy, and it's the third of those that I'm going to be looking at today. And then a fourth pilot followed on a couple of years later, which was a broader look at a wider set of macrostructural reforms. Next slide. The climate energy pilot, it covered 26 countries. So essentially, it was up to the IMF's area departments to nominate countries undergoing Article 4 surveillance. This is the fund's standard engagement, essentially annual engagement with all its members, where it assesses the state of the members' economy. That's Article 4 surveillance. And there were 26 of these country Article 4 surveillance teams which put themselves forward to participate in the energy pilot in 3 waves over 2015 to 2018. There was some central support, but the collaboration that these teams pursued as part of the pilot was left largely to the discretion of the country teams. Quite a lot of them decided that the climate issue that they wanted to focus on was around energy taxes and subsidies, which is a structural issue that the fund has quite a long history of looking at and expertise in. But some of the 26 pilots decided that the macro critical issue was more around building resilience to natural disasters, which was a newer area for the fund. All the pilots were subject to fairly regular review, and in September 2017, it was decided that the energy climate pilot would not be mainstreamed, in contrast to the other 3 pilots. Although in practice that meant that Article 4 surveillance teams could still consider energy and climate issues where those were thought to be macro critical, but there wouldn't be at this point. There wasn't a decision to essentially ramp up the resources and the support for country teams that wanted to look at climate and energy issues. Next slide talks about the wider IMF work on climate and energy. As I said, there's a long-standing tradition of the IMF looking at energy and fuel pricing and taxation to address externalities. 2015, the former managing director, Christine Lagarde, broadened the fund's role, explicitly looking for more attention on natural disaster risks and preparedness, climate adaptation, and also climate-related financial sector issues and risks. 2016, there was a specific initiative started jointly with the bank to do climate change policy assessments, which were focused initially on 6 small states, small island states that are particularly at risk of climate issues, where the fund and the bank would look at different aspects of the full waterfront of policy responses needed to the various aspects and implications of climate change. 2019, with the new IMF managing director, she fairly early on moved to emphasize that climate change would be becoming a higher priority for the fund. Since she's been in post, this has manifested itself as a recognition for the importance of greening the recovery following the COVID crisis. A kind of renewed fund initiative to integrate climate change into its surveillance work, and also a review that's I think still ongoing of the climate change policy assessment pilot that I mentioned. Next slide, please. And the one after that, so I'm going to talk a bit about the evaluation approach. So the motivation is that there hasn't been a formal review of bank fund collaboration really since 2010. In that time, several other IEO evaluations have identified issues with bank fund collaboration in particular contexts. So it came up in an evaluation we did looking at the IMF's work in fragile states, for example, and also the IMF's work on financial surveillance. And I think it would be fair to say that there was a fair amount of board interest in the way that bank fund collaboration had worked, in particular because collaboration had been touted by management as a way to square the circle between, on the one hand, increasing demands for fund to look at macro structural issues, but at a time when its budget was being held constant in real terms, and collaboration was hoped or expected to be a way to square that circle. And I think the board were interested to see the extent to which that had actually happened. Next slide, please. So the scope, as I say, we're going to focus. We did focus on the 4 macrostructural pilots, and I'm today focusing on the climate and energy, one of those 4. We also looked at some longer-standing areas of bank fund collaboration, particularly in the areas of debt and tax. Our focus was mostly on collaboration in the context of fund surveillance work. Of course, the fund works very closely with the bank in those countries where the fund has a program or a lending program. And there's also collaboration in the context of the fund's capacity development work. But we focus mostly on surveillance because that was the context within which the 4 pilots were designed and intended to operate. We mostly looked at the fund's work with the bank. But we also we tried to draw lessons from the IMF's engagement with other partners, the OECD, some UN agencies, the WTO. The evaluation period was 2014 to 2019. And as I say, this particular presentation focuses on the climate energy pilot. Next slide on the questions. So we were looking at trying to understand what the fund's vision for collaboration was in the context of the pilots. How did it operationalize that vision? What collaboration took place, and then making an assessment of whether that collaboration was effective, particularly in terms of quality, influence, and efficiency. And then secondly, we wanted to discern the factors that seem particularly important in supporting or hindering external collaboration. And finally, identifying lessons for the fund to strengthen its external collaboration. Next slide. Standard set of methods. I might just highlight the 2 surveys which we did on the one hand of fund staff and on the other hand of bank staff, and we obviously designed some overlapping questions so that we could get a handle on whether there were similar or consistent differences in the attitudes and views of bank and fund staff on some aspects of collaboration. And we tried to find some simple ways to quantify collaboration, which is the next slide. Clearly, collaboration is a rather slippery concept to measure. These are 3 of the things that we did come up with that I think give some indication, albeit with obvious limitations. The first chart on the left there shows some counts of citations in various IMF papers, both background papers to country-specific Article 4 reports, which are the blue bars there, and in the red bars, a sample of IMF policy and cross-cutting research papers, and that gives you a sense there that there were a lot more citations from the academic literature, for example, than from World Bank sources. The second little picture there is a table that we pulled together, drawing on some rankings, which we essentially did of annexes which appear in all Article 4 IMF Article 4 reports, which summarise the engagement that the IMF team has had with the bank. So we were able to essentially rank or grade those annexes, looking at 2 years worth of reports, 2009 to 2017, and to get a sense from that about whether those annexes were informative and what they were saying about the state of bank fund collaboration. And then finally, the third diagram there is just an example of how we quantified some of the survey responses. So next slide, and then again moving on to the findings. So the extent of collaboration overall was uneven, looking across the 26 IMF pilot countries. The extent of collaboration did seem to depend quite heavily on which climate and energy issue the team had selected. So those that decided to focus on energy taxes tended to rely heavily on IMF existing IMF expertise. Those teams that looked, say, more at resilience to natural disasters, more of those teams did actually reach out to the bank. We didn't find many cases of co-authored background papers to article full reports. A few cases which showed that some teams had decided that was something that was important to them. But I think it was only around 3 of the 26 countries that were in the sample, that were in the pilot, where there were co-authored papers. None of the analytical or policy papers we looked at on climate change had been co-authored with the bank, although several of the board papers that went to the IMF board on climate issues did have some amount of bank engagement underpinning them. In terms of the effectiveness, we concluded that had also been mixed. There were cases where collaboration seemed to have worked well. For example, in the development of the framework for the climate change policy assessment, that was very much a joint bank fund project, and some of the 6 countries that undertook CCPAs, both bank and fund staff were positive about working with each other. And one other positive to highlight is that one of the themes that we got fairly consistently from the bank was that a benefit for them from working with the fund is that it could sometimes help open some doors. For example, in engaging with finance ministries, that sometimes the bank wouldn't always find it easy to get access to finance ministries. That was easier where they work closely with the fund team. On the other hand, there were cases we found of mixed messages around climate change. There was a case in 2015 when in a fairly short space of time, the bank and the fund each produced separate estimates of the global cost of energy subsidies that were different by a factor of 10. And it turned out that the 2 estimates were consistent with one another once you understood the different assumptions that had been made. But nonetheless, that wasn't helpful in terms of reinforcing the credibility and impact of each institution's big number about the cost of energy subsidies. And we found cases of missed opportunities as well. I think particularly on work on the financial sector, where we heard some frustration expressed by the bank that they felt that there was a lot more work that they could have done with the fund, that certainly in the evaluation period we were looking at, there wasn't the kind of resource and focus from the fund on some of the financial sector aspects of climate change. And then the third main finding was that the resource savings for the fund from collaboration were limited at best. Next slide. Some of the wider lessons for collaboration from the climate energy pilot. I think in this policy area, there are clear complementarities between the bank and the fund in terms of expertise and mandate, and that ought to provide the basis for productive collaboration. Second, greater attention by the fund to the constraints and the incentives on bank staff would have helped to understand the incentives and the constraints facing the bank, and perhaps a greater effort to acknowledge bank input, and a bit more flexibility on the fund side around the timings and format of publication might have engendered greater motivation and commitment from the bank in some cases. I mentioned about the case of the analytical work looking at the global cost of fuel subsidies. Again, more and earlier effort by the fund to engage with the bank could have avoided some of those mixed messages and missed opportunities. Bank and fund both expressed frustration in being able to identify the right counterpart and figuring out who was in charge on a particular issue. So both sides struggled with that, and that does seem something that could be fixed relatively easily. A fairly consistent message from a lot of our bank interviewees about limited IMF resources on climate and energy, which on the one hand led some fund teams to actively reach out to the bank, as I mentioned, in the area of natural resilience to natural disasters. But on the whole, the view of the bank was that, and indeed on the part of some of our fund interviewees, was that the lack of fund resources on climate was overall a hindrance to collaboration. I think because it made it harder for the bank to get the engagement and responsiveness that they were perhaps hoping for. And then finally, the success, broadly speaking, of the climate change policy assessment pilot, I think, suggests the potential benefits of a bottom-up or organic approach to collaboration in some cases. So the CCPA essentially started, at the initiative of a few individuals on both the fund and the bank side who, without getting kind of extra additional dedicated resources, got the process underway and built it up, and it's generally seemed to have worked well. So an interesting model, I think, particularly for the fund, as on the whole a fairly top-down driven organisation to bear in mind. Next slide. Trying to draw together our conclusions about which are the factors, the key factors affecting collaboration. On the one hand, the unevenness of collaboration that we found across within the climate energy pilot, and indeed more generally across the 4 pilots. I think that in part reflects the centralized approach on the whole that the fund decided to adopt for the pilots. We found quite a lot of evidence to suggest that there is some truth in the fund's caricature as a culture that emphasizes self-reliance. Or a tendency to kind of look inside rather than outside for help, and I think that was reinforced by the challenges of working between the bank and the fund. I mentioned about the challenges of finding the right people, but also more generally the challenges around different operating models, different emphasis in terms of organizational goals and timetables and processes. Another factor, two other factors sort of causing the unevenness, I think. One is, as I mentioned earlier, the lack of systematic consideration by the fund of the incentives and constraints on bank staff to collaborate. And of course, a factor that we heard, I think, in almost every interview that we did, the importance of personality and other idiosyncratic factors. The preferences of individuals, the chemistry between individuals is often seen as the critical factor explaining whether or not there was collaboration and how well it worked. And then I think, secondly, it's worth just emphasizing that what we identified as the enabling factors in those areas where bank fund collaboration was deeper and generally seemed to be working more effectively, particularly in the areas of debt and financial sector. And I think there are 3 key drivers from this. One is that they reflect policy areas where there's clear messages from stakeholders, shareholders, who of course are broadly the same across the fund and the bank, clear messages from those shareholders that the bank and the fund need to work together on those particular issues, debt and financial sector issues. In both cases, or in those cases, clear mutual organizational benefits from collaboration, and then agreement on roles and respective responsibilities, and indeed tailored frameworks that have been adapted over time, because the bank and the fund have worked together on these debt and financial sector issues for a good 20 years or so. So that's given them time to hone the frameworks and make sure that they are developed over time. Okay. So finally, a couple of slides on recommendations in the evaluation. So there are 4 essentially. Firstly, that the fund should seek to agree concrete specific frameworks with partners where it judges collaboration to bring the greatest strategic returns. Secondly, the fund needs to improve its internal incentives for its staff to collaborate, and also address some of the cultural reluctance to look for outside help. Third, the fund needs to work with the bank to find ways to improve access to and knowledge and exchange of information and knowledge. And then fourth, we think there's a role for the IMF board to strengthen its role to facilitate collaboration through its oversight role. And final slide, just to say a little bit more finally about recommendation 1. We in the IO think that the climate area is a good candidate for a tailored framework, and that framework should at a minimum set out the goals of collaboration and the roles of each institution, reflect appropriate incentives for the staff of both institutions to work together. That's likely to partly come from the endorsement of senior bank and fund managements. On the fund side, as I said, there should be consideration about the quantity and type and deployment of the resources that the fund needs, both to facilitate the collaboration but also mitigate the risks. And then finally, specifically, identify in senior individuals to act as focal points for collaboration. And that's all I was planning to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So just before I turn it over to the panelists, there's an awful lot of very interesting material there. I draw people's attention to the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen in the middle, and that's where you can submit questions for Michael or for any of the panelists. Before we go forward, it just strikes me that there are 3 dimensions to what Michael's presented that people may want to ask questions about. The first is the climate-specific stuff, and that's the issues specifically related to what the bank and the fund can and should do together in the climate change area. But then there's the broader issue of bank-fund collaboration, the institutional dimensions, incentives, disincentives, and then since this is essentially a conference of evaluators, there's some methodological issues that people may want to ask about. It strikes me that IO evaluations look a little different than a lot of MDB evaluation reports, and it may be interesting to pursue some of that. We can all decide where we want to go with that once I start get some questions in. But let me start off by turning to Bernice from the World Bank. Over to you, Bernice. You may still be muted. You may need to put your headset on. But while we're straightening that out, why don't I go to James and we'll come back to Bernice. James, are you? We'll work out the sound stuff for Bernice while James goes ahead.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Very well. Yes.
Okay. So thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. And good evening to the few of us here in DC. This is very timely presentation, I think, for us, because we're just in the evaluation for us, because we're just in the phase now of gearing up our climate work a lot. So it's very important for us to think about these issues while we're doing that. But let me say at the start that I've been working in the fund now for 25 years, and in those 25 years, one is always working with bank fund collaboration in one way or another, it's either been effective, deep, or sometimes shallow and not very effective. But this is one area where I found it extremely effective in the time that I've been doing it, just the last few months. So I can speak more to that than the earlier period, but I would make maybe a couple of observations about how things are changing and how that may have affected it as well. But I do think at the moment we are enjoying really exceptional collaboration in the climate area, and I think that's because we're so different in the resources we have in climate at the moment. I mean, I'm in a new role, but until I started this role as coordinating fiscal policy work on climate, we had one person working full-time on climate in the fund, compared to, I Bernice can correct me, but I think probably hundreds in the bank who have expertise and knowledge on climate. So this is really something where there's a big imbalance and obviously a huge need on the fund side for the expertise that the bank has. So we are now gearing up. As I said, we're hiring more people. I think, Jeff, you mentioned how our new managing director is very keen to put climate at the center of our work and really mainstream it across all the work of the fund. But we've got a long way to go, and a lot of that road will involve kind of learning from others, learning from the bank, and of course other institutions as well. So we're currently, hiring to set up a small unit. I think by the end of this year, we may have, instead of one person working full-time on climate, we may have 8 or 10. But the idea eventually is to have climate kind of understood across the fund, so that our mission teams are able to have a dialogue on climate going across. Now, I think there's obvious complementarity and obvious need for collaboration, just from the way that the work is different. We focus on macro issues to do with climate. So, and the bank has a sectoral level of expertise that is absolutely necessary. If we think about adaptation work, that's very much rooted in sectoral details. Now, we want to know and discuss with ministers of finance, central banks, and so on, the macroeconomic impacts of adaptation needs. But that depends on what these sectoral stories are, which is really where we need the expertise from the bank to understand all the details at the sectoral level. Mitigation, it seems more like a natural kind of macro area when we talk about tax policy, carbon pricing, and things like that as a sort of macro issue. But carbon pricing, to be effective, it needs to be supported by sectoral level policies. And again, that's where the expertise is. If you're talking about the transport sector, the housing sector, the power sector, there's all kinds of market imperfections and issues that need to be addressed, where we're not going to have that level of expertise, and so we need to work with the bank to understand that and to build it up into the macro position. And it's the same with the financial sector when we think about financial sector policies for climate change. So I think this is somewhere where collaboration is essential, and that's something that's going to continue as even as we build up our expertise and our resources in the area. Maybe I mention a couple of areas of particularly close collaboration that I think already mentioned, but I maybe give my perspective on it because I'm involved in both of them. One is the climate change policy assessments, which is this diagnostic tool which Mike mentioned, introduced by the fund and in collaboration with the World Bank, which looks across all climate policies and sees how they need to be integrated into vulnerabilities. And so on, and see how that needs to be integrated into macroeconomic and country policies, budget policies, tax policies, and risk management, and so on. So this is something that again, we need to have the sectoral level understanding to be able to do effectively. We've been doing these missions jointly with the World Bank, so that's been we've done that at a pilot phase, and now we're considering expanding that into a broader program that continues with, instead of just being what's been basically small island economies so far, to consider expanding the coverage to larger countries, emerging market countries, perhaps even advanced countries. And there it's quite interesting because we're engaged in a debate with the World Bank about how to do this, but both sides are very keen to make this a joint product. It probably means the collaboration on the design of it probably means it takes a bit longer to decide on exactly what the template is going to be, what the country coverage is going to be, because the bank and the fund have slightly different perspectives on what this. But I think this is a valuable process that ends up with a stronger product. Both sides, both the bank and the fund can fully get behind and fully support. So that's if you like, a cost of collaboration is some longer time to agree on exactly how it's going to look, but I think we as I say, it's well worth it. The other area I wanted to mention was this coalition of finance ministers for climate action, it's a group of finance ministers put together with the support of the World Bank a couple of years ago to discuss climate mitigation policies, in recognition that really it's finance ministries that are critical in the end for climate policies to take effect. It's all very well for environmental ministries and so on talk about climate change, but if you want to really see action, you need to see it at in the finance ministry, leading tax policy, investment policy, and so on to see it happen. So it's extremely important initiative, and it started in the World Bank, but it's obviously something where the fund can bring in a lot of value as well, including the point I think Mike mentioned about access. You know, we have a dialogue with finance ministers across the world, not only developing emerging market countries, but also the advanced countries where we have our regular surveillance relationships. So these are, you know, a lot of the big emitters are ones where we have this direct dialogue every year with finance ministers. So that's an obvious area for us to work together, and that's exactly what we're doing. You know, we're joining the Secretariat, and I'm personally very closely involved in that. And we have a very, very close relationship with the World Bank there. So that's I think working well. So I think both of these areas are ones in which you know, one of the recommendations of the report was to have a sort of more structured relationship or more structured frameworks. And I think in both of those areas, you know, that's exactly what we're doing. You know, we in the CCPA, we're talking about a framework for, you know, hammer out a framework for how we're going to do those. Same with the coalition, we're working on a framework for how we support it and how we collaborate between the bank and the fund. So I think that's a well taken recommendation in that area. I think, you know, in other areas, I wouldn't say that we would agree with that recommendation across all areas of bank fund collaboration to do with climate. You know, some areas work more naturally with an informal networks and informal understandings. We have a lot of that happening as well. You know, my colleagues and myself, we spend a lot of time talking with the World Bank, and we know our counterparts in the bank, and when we're doing analysis and policy dialogue, we know who to talk to, and we have that discussion. We have a joint seminar series, for example, on climate. Again, it's all fairly informal. I don't think it really needs a formal framework for that. I think just to come back to this point I mentioned at the start of the past versus the future, I think one thing that looking forward, why I'm sort of more hopeful about successful collaboration, is that when we come to the country teams of the fund in the past, you know, they may not have really known who to speak to in the World Bank very much. And the role that I have is not only coordination kind of within the fund, but it's also coordination with these other institutions. So I'm coordinating with the country team, you know, who may be looking at a climate issue in its Article 4 surveillance, but I can also put them in touch with the right people in the bank and vice versa from the bank. So I think we may have a, you know, a better framework now with you know, with these resources we're putting into coordination and thinking more about climate work in the fund. And there I think that, again, there was a recommendation, Mike, you mentioned about focal point, and I suppose, you know, in that sense, my unit is and other similar units in other departments will be these focal points to help collaboration. Thanks.
Great, thanks, James. Bernice, I think we've solved your sound problem.
Yes, I can hear
Perfect.
you. Can you hear
Excellent.
me? Can you hear me
Yes,
now?
excellent.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, James and Michael, of course, for your presentation. And of course, I spoke with Michael during his investigation, so well familiar with the evaluation. So, I mean, not to belabor too many of the points, but I think you know, I think the recommendations many of them are absolutely spot on and really clearly, you know, capture, I think, some of the things that our experience has been in collaborating with the IMF. But I also just really want to highlight what James just said. I think qualitatively and frankly even quantitatively, the collaboration has really changed over the last, I would say, 6 to 12 months. And I think that in part shows probably the really critical importance of the sort of, you know, senior management really indicating support for the agenda and really setting in place the right resources, you know, financial, human, you know, the fact that James can go out and hire, you know, many new specialists, climate specialists into the IMF, but also the incentives for staff to work on this topic. So clearly, you know, I think that signaling is the sort of, you know, probably the number one factor that we need to have right in place. So certainly that's what's happening right now. I think many of the things James mentioned are, you know, we're very excited about. We see a lot of scope for collaboration with the IMF on climate. And I think there's been a historical, you know, evolution. If you look at climate change in the World Bank, it's true that we have hundreds of people working on it, you know, whether full-time or part-time, but many of these are specialists working in sectoral areas. So you'll find, you know, climate smart agriculture specialists, or, you know, people worrying about air pollution and public health outcomes, or, you know, disaster risk management, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We actually have only a handful of macro fiscal economist colleagues working on climate change in the World Bank. And I think that's historically is where the disconnect has been a little bit between the IMF and the World Bank. Very different departments, very different language often that we use to look at some of these issues. Even though we have fundamentally overlapping interests, I think often it's been harder to, you know, to speak the same language and bring them together. The fact that we inside the bank are now really also scaling up our work. Our macro fiscal colleagues are really starting to think about climate much more seriously. And James mentioned the Coalition of Finance Ministers, which is something that we have, you know, we handle the secretariat for it. And it's, you know, again, clear indication that we are scaling up that work. At the same time, the IMF is also really thinking about how to scale up. It allows for a level of collaboration that just hasn't, you know, we haven't had the resources or even the personnel in the past to really, you know, really get to that scale of collaboration. And it's obviously what's needed right now. I mean, the climate challenge is huge, and we do need to involve ministries of finance. We do need to think of the macro fiscal risks and how to tackle those. It's not just, you know, a matter for the energy specialist and the transport specialist and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It really has to be elevated to that macro fiscal level. So again, collaboration is really, really important. And I think we're learning to do that better, and we're learning to, you know, to speak the same language a little bit more. I think it is also important, as was mentioned, that we have some kind of framework in place. You know, we've mentioned around the climate change policy assessments. I think we're keen to do that. I think also we're keen not to over formalize this. I think there's a lot of informal collaboration, as James mentioned, that is growing, and that should be there. Informal peer reviewing, assistance, just generally, you know, really working together, which is great. I think the other thing is that what came out of the evaluation that I also want to emphasize that is just really important as well is this consistency of message, so that we don't end up, right, the bank and the IMF writing papers around the same time, coming out with very different messages as has happened in the past. So it's really important that we don't contradict each other, and that we, you know, we are not afraid at the same time to have really robust and frank discussions about, you know, things that are invariably really, really difficult issues where we may end up having different emphasis or different approaches to how we want to support our clients. But we do want to be careful that we don't end up confusing our clients and have, you know, that inconsistency of message. So I think the other thing came out in the evaluation, yes, personal relationships are key. It is often about the people and about, you know, the chemistry and you know, the pre-existing foundations of you know, having built, you know, trusting relationships before. Again, I think we are in a situation right now where we have really incentivized our staff on the bank side. My sense is the staff on the IMF side are also really incentivized to really move forward and go beyond just, you know, the few personal relationships, but really build on that and scale up the work. So I think that's, you know, that's really heading in the right directions. Lastly, again, I just want to, I mean, James said a lot of it already, but, you know, the areas where we really can scale up work and we're excited about is the CCPAs. You know, really develop them into co-owned joint publication series and really also think about how we extend them from the small island states to the large emitters, which is going to be, you know, a whole different ballgame and a lot, you know, very many different challenges than we've seen with the small island states. You know, and really, you know, again, have frank discussions about how we can get our two institutions to work together jointly on these. And come up with the right analytical tools so that are used for the CCPAs, particularly as we move into these large emitter countries. There's other tools that we're working on together, such as the carbon pricing assessment tool, the CPAT, that we can also, you know, use as part of the CCPA analyses for carbon pricing policies. So there's a number of different things they're working on. And you know, again, lastly, just to re-emphasize the importance of working with ministries of finance and the finance minister, the coalition of finance ministers for climate action. You know, we're just, you know, really excited for the IMF to take, you know, a bigger role in there. And it's going to really help strengthen, again, the joint messaging that we, you know, we bring out there, that, you know, the importance of finance ministers to engage on this topic, that this is not just, you know, a topic for ministries of environment or ministries of you know, energy, but that this is actually potentially really impacting also on macro fiscal, you know, outcomes for many economies. So again, a lot to do together. I think we're really in a good space. It was really good timing to have this this evaluation, but you know, if you ask me, I'd put my money on a very different kind of evaluation if you were to come back in 3 years and did it all over again. So those are sort of my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before I start to throw questions at everyone, let me give Michael a chance to react or respond to anything he's heard.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Maybe just 2 or 3 points just quickly to respond to. I thought it was interesting that both James and Bernice pointed to the recent changes to the kind of level of engagement, and Bernice emphasizing the importance of the signals coming from the new leadership in the IMF as a catalyst for that change. But also kind of linked to that, I think what James was explained very starkly about the disparity in amounts of resources, expertise focused on climate change in the two organizations. Even a year or so ago, where, you know, the fund had a very small amount of dedicated expertise focused on climate issues, and how that's changing now. So I think that that kind of reinforces one of the or a couple of the lessons that emerged from our evaluation. I thought Bernice said something interesting about the importance of common language, and I think that perhaps points to the need for actually some overlapping expertise between two organizations, especially in the climate area, because you could take a sort of a hardline efficiency view which said, well, the fund will do the macroeconomics of it and the bank will do all the rest. But if there's no overlap in terms of for example, people in the bank who think about climate from a macro perspective, then it's going to be much harder for the two organizations to understand each other, and that overlap, that kind of is necessary to help the development of a shared language, and also you know, for the macro people in the fund essentially to act as a bridge, or potentially a conduit between the fund climate people and the wider bank community of climate experts. And then maybe the third point is just to pick up a point that James made about the fund's view that a formal framework isn't necessarily the right answer for every aspect of climate collaboration with the bank, and I don't think we were advocating a blanket approach where you only think about having formal frameworks. On the other hand, of course, the risk is that you're effectively relying too much on individuals and kind of idiosyncratic factors. And I think that points to our second recommendation about the fund needing to think systematically about the incentives through various kind of HR levers that the fund needs to put in place to support collaborative behaviour, and also potentially tackle the wider kind of cultural issues around self-reliance in the fund. And if you've got that, if you're trying to address those kind of underlying issues, then that's going to give you more confidence that where an informal collaborative approach is appropriate, that's going to be sustained and not solely dependent on particular individuals. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Michael. So I encourage participants to add, to submit some questions. In the meantime, let me be just a little provocative. I think we all agree that climate's important. We all agree collaboration's important. So the issue is, what is to be gained from bank fund collaboration, other than it's important we collaborate, we both work in this space. So the question I have is there a good understanding of what the division of labor is and what the complementarity is? The bank has its own macro people, its own fiscal people. So what does the dialogue with the fund offer? And is there agreement on what that complementarity and division of labor is? Next question is Bernice said that bank staff were incentivized. And at the same time, Michael's saying that there's a need to address the incentive issues. What are the incentives that are in place on the climate side? And then the third question I'll lob it at you is, if I understand correctly, the original motivation for collaboration on the fund side was efficiency. We can draw on the bank so we don't have to do it ourselves. But it seems that we're now in a world where no one talks about that, and it's more about, well, we need to work together. So what happened to efficiency? So let me throw those three out, and feel free to respond to any of the three of them. There are more. Do you want to go first, James, maybe?
Okay, let me just say one thing. Maybe one easy one is on the incentives. I think the point Mike was making was more about the incentives to collaborate, right? I think there are now very strong incentives in the fund to work on climate. I think that was something that was certainly lacking in the last few years, where it wasn't obviously chosen as a central topic for the fund, and now increasingly with our previous managing director, particularly with the new one, it's very clear that this is a central thing that we're doing, and it's being fed through. I think people can see the incentives, but so I think the question is about the incentives to collaborate, and I think that is an issue I've seen throughout my career. I see people who are quite happily terrible collaborators with the World Bank, and we need to collaborate in almost everything we do. That's what I was saying. So, every job I've had, has been something where we should be collaborating with not only the bank but with others, but particularly with the bank. And it's not really something which is adequately incentivized, I think, in the fund. So that's certainly true. And we need to work harder on that. I don't know what the answer is. I hope that Mike has some answers for what we should do, what needs to be put in place to make that happen better. I think on the efficiency, what happens to the efficiency? I think I do very much agree with Mike that we cannot just separate macro from structural or sectoral in this area. We have to have areas where we have this common language, but I think there is this. Don't forget, we have a rather different constituencies that we're talking to here in the fund. So the fact that we have the dialogue every year in our surveillance relationship with the US, Japan, Canada, Western Europe. The bank is not in that sphere so much. So I think although we can have a sort of common understanding on policies, we're able then to sort of bring that more directly into that dialogue. So I think that's important as well. Now I'll stop there and let Bernice take the more difficult questions.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, first of all, I mean, look, these are difficult questions. I mean, efficiency, efficiency is important, obviously, but I just want to say that I think probably still surprising to many outsiders outside of the IMF and the bank, how few people are actually working on these issues, full time, So I think maximizing our scarce resources, especially given that there are so many other non-climate related, priorities that we're also working on. I mean, not least, of course, COVID right now. It's really critical that we work together very closely, and we are one voice, and we sort of we amplify our messages that way. So I think that's the first point I wanted to make. Second point, I think, is also to say that yes, complementarity is of course a really important consideration. I mean, addressing climate change is really, really hard. The scale of the challenge, of global decarbonization by 2050 or whatever goal we have in mind is really, really unprecedented, and it really is. It's not inevitable, and it's not obviously equitable or effective either. To do it right is really, really difficult. So designing and implementing policies that can achieve these goals in a way that supports development really requires knowledge of so many different areas. So you do need your climate scientists, and you need your energy specialists, but you also need your macroeconomists, and you need your microeconomists, and you need your health specialists, etc. So really, we can't do this in isolation from each other. So you can say, yes, okay, maybe the IMF has more, macro fiscal knowledge, and the bank has more of the sectoral knowledge. But again, it is really, really only, we only get to effective climate action if we pull these things together. So again, I think that's sort of my plea as to why perhaps we need to work harder at developing that common language, so that we do come out with that sort of, very, a consistent message that we can amplify by working together as opposed to being at cross purposes. So, yeah.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add?
For now.
Yeah, I thought I might just respond to James's challenge about giving the answer to addressing or enhancing incentives within the fund for more collaborative behaviour. I think in one sense it's fairly easy to identify what some of the levers are for that. And in terms of your kind of HR levers, you can think about recruitment. So do you actively seek to recruit people who are more inclined or better at working with others, both within the organization and outside? Is that one of the set of behaviors or characteristics that you emphasize in your recruitment? Clearly you can do the same thing in your performance appraisal and management systems, and explicitly look to assess people against those collaborative type of behaviors. And of course, through your promotion criteria and decisions and the signals that you send through who you decide to promote. Of course, the challenge is that there's so many things that one could say, well, we'd like to promote behavior X or Y through those kind of mechanisms. And you can't overload an HR system with 60 desirable characteristics that you're trying to promote. So the challenge is clearly deciding which things you do want to try and change through those types of levers, and then once you've decided that perhaps that more collaborative and outward-looking behaviours are indeed one of those priorities, then you follow that through those processes.
Thank you. So, Michael, the evaluation makes the point that collaboration seems to be best where there's a if not a formal framework, but then like a joint diagnostic or joint activity. Like on the debt side, they've got joint DSAs. It's very clear what the respective roles are. On the financial sector side, you've got the FSAP, bank looks after development, the fund looked after stability, and that where things are left more or less, bottom up, it's less effective. Does that mean that we should be looking towards some sort of a joint diagnostic? Would that improve the quality of the collaboration, or is it too soon to be thinking along those lines?
No, I think the evidence that we found suggests that in some cases a joint diagnostic, as James emphasised with the climate change policy assessment initiative, which a big part of that is a joint diagnostic tool. And that, I think, you know, has been successful, and that joint framework diagnostic underpinning it has been an important part of that. So I think there's evidence that that approach works. I think particularly for the fund, which is, you know, an organization that seems to respond well to top-down or centrally mandated frameworks and approaches. I guess, and it's not really for me to pronounce as an expert on the bank, but I have a sense that that approach may not be as well suited to the bank. So, you know, we wouldn't want to jump to the conclusion that what's right for the fund is right for the bank. But again, you know, the CCPA does suggest that that kind of diagnostic underpinning approach has worked for the bank as well as the fund in that instance. So that's a model that I think is worth you know, exploring further in other contexts.
Let me pose that question to Bernice. When I went on the website to look at what CCPAs were in existence, they were almost all small states, particularly islands. So with the emphasis being very much on adaptation. Is there a need for or benefit of a joint diagnostic exercise that extends beyond small states, Bernice?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what I sort of mentioned earlier in my comments. I think it's really critical that we take this tool and adapt it to particularly looking at the large emitters. No, so I mean, we're particularly concerned at what's happening. You know, say the Indonesias, Vietnams, etc. of the world. If we can take this kind of collaboration there, that would really, I think, you know, could potentially be really impactful. It's very challenging. So again, it will require quite a lot of sort of, you know, putting our heads together and again, frank conversations and being open to each other's ideas about how to do this in a context that's not a small island state. Just to come back a little bit on the you know, what Michael was talking about earlier, you know, the idea of having this agreed framework or you know, MOU, or how we do this. My sense is that often the work itself is done fairly easily together between our, you know, colleagues from the bank and the IMF, the analytics, and, you know, the sort of, you know, going on a mission together, etc. I think where we often run into trouble as two institutions is that we have very different review processes and clearance processes. And that's where sort of it gets a little bit tricky. You know, who gets to clear what and who clears first, and then the other one gets to comment or not, and when, and then I think that's where we probably, if we go in sort of very clear, we know where we are and we know who clears what and when and what the process is. You know, which does it go to the board? Does it go to the World Bank board? Does it go to the IMF board, etc.? No, I mean, we have these different organizational processes. I think that's caused a lot of probably frustration, at least on the World Bank side in the past. I suspect also on the IMF side sometimes, and when we've collaborated. So going into these, say if we do a whole new round of climate change policy assessments in a set of new countries, going into that knowing what the process is going to look like. You know, once the work has been done, because again, I want to emphasize, I think the teams often collaborate very well together on the ground and they do the work. It's interesting, we're excited about it, it's important, but it's then sometimes a bureaucratic piece of it that sort of, you know, becomes a little bit harder to manage. So I would say going into things with that clearly spelled out and agreed up front would really help.
Thank you. So James may be dreading me turning this question to the fund. So outside of small states, what is the fund's appetite for joint diagnostics on larger economies and also economies that are on the bank side, part one rather than part two?
Well, exactly. That's something we need to discuss and work out how to do it, because you know, we certainly, I guess we started this CCPA process focused on the small states. You know, we're ready to expand it. We wanted to expand it anyway, so we're happy to expand with the bank. I think the bank may be more ambitious more quickly than us about it. That's possible, but that's probably a good thing, right? I mean, ambition, you know. I think the question will be, it's going to be a bit of a different instrument, and we have to work out it probably, at the moment it sort of covers everything, and it may be that if you go to larger countries, it's much harder to do that. We have to be quite selective, I think, about how we treat the sectors, because if you go to Indonesia and try to have full coverage of all the sectors and everything, where you could write this thing could become like an encyclopedia, right? I mean, there's so much knowledge about it that we have to distill. So we have to work out how to reflect that sectoral knowledge in an effective way, and build it up into something which is sort of manageable. So I think this is a really exciting discussion, and something that we want to have about how to do it, and then think about what it would mean if we did it in an advanced country as well, a sort of predominantly emitting issue, when I think about how to do that. So I don't think if you want to get grand about it, we might say eventually this could become like the FSAP or something like that. I think we're a long way from being sure of that. We want to keep doing it, expanding it, like trying it, but you can see that's a possible thing at the end there, that it could become instituted more like an FSAP, and an FSAP doesn't cover the same thing everywhere it goes, right? I mean, there's different focuses and different focuses at different times when you do updates and things like that. So you can see, in fact, I mean, I would actually draw a parallel, with climate work in the fund, at least. I mean, the bank has been doing it for longer, but for us, it feels a little bit like the financial sector, when in the 90s or so on, the fund increasingly took on the financial sector as an area of expertise. And we've ended up with this sort of, pretty extensive understanding of financial sector. It's really is deep in all of country teams. We have the FSAPs, and we're collaborating pretty effectively, I think, with the bank across the financial sector issues as well. So I mean, this is sort of looking further forward, but it just feels to me a little bit like the early days of that kind of evolution. I just wanted to say one thing about what Bernice had said about the processes. I mean, this is with the CCPA, we have delinked it now from the surveillance function. So it used to be that CCPAs were only going with Article 4s. And that's exactly why, that we don't want it to be, ideally it would still go with the Article 4, so the board is considering it together, but it's delinked, formally delinked, so that we're able to do it, in a time frame that we can agree properly with the World Bank, and that respects both of our institutional constraints. I mean, but just on that, part of the problem is these institutional constraints. I think both institutions do have pretty cumbersome procedures for bringing things through review and to the board, and the fact that coordinating the bank's ones with the funds ones is not just, it's not purely a cost of bank fund collaboration. It's a cost of our procedures, right? If we had more streamlined and better procedures for managing documents and things like that, then we would be much better on both sides, would be more timely in everything we do, and the collaboration would be easier.
Just want to encourage the participants to submit some questions. We had a question about financing of joint bank fund climate projects. Clearly there are none, but I think that really speaks to the issue of is there an understood division of labor even on analytical work? I guess a question for Michael, since the evaluation looked at more than just climate, also looked at macro structural, looked at financial sector. Is there something particularly different about collaboration in the climate space from the other aspects of collaboration you studied?
I think one difference, Jeff, is the kind of the recent emergence, particularly on the fund side, of a priority or a particular focus on it, and indeed that's perhaps I didn't explain this very well in the presentation, but that's why although the IMF Board consideration of the full evaluation that we did has been postponed, we took the opportunity to go to the board and talk specifically about what we found around the climate pilot and the collaboration in that context, precisely because of the areas that we looked at. That I think is an issue that, as James and Bernice have both explained, is live and pertinent at the moment. Both institutions are thinking about how best to work together. So it seemed that that part of our evaluation was hopefully particularly relevant at the moment. So I think that's the kind of, from our point of view, that's the key difference. I'm trying to think if there are other ways, compared to what else we look at, inequality and gender. I mean, possibly climate is broader in terms of the range of different policy areas that it touches, that in a sense makes it more challenging. But as James was implying, it's pretty clear to both institutions that there are gains from trade. So maybe that's another dimension in which it's different from the other areas. But as I say, the main one is just the immediacy of particularly from the fund side of changing the way it's working on that particular macro structural issue.
And
maybe if I can
yes,
just
please.
complement what Michael just said. I mean, again, if you think of climate at the World Bank, we've had our first climate change action plan, that just closed the 5-year plan just now, and it's really looking across all the sectors, right? So you're looking at climate smart cities, you're looking at transport, you're looking at energy, you're looking at climate and health, climate and gender, climate and community-driven development, climate and forests, climate and oceans, climate and I can just keep going on, right? There is just tremendous amount of cross-sectoral work going on. So the sort of the piece where we actually have sort of real common interest and common expertise is actually a fairly small slice of that work, right? That's really sort of where we're talking about the macro fiscal impacts of climate risk, etc. The carbon pricing, the taxation. So that's, but from the bank's perspective, that's really just one subset of areas that we work on in the climate space. So that makes climate a little bit unique, I think, compared to other areas where, it really sort of, it's transversal, it touches almost everything we do in development. Whilst if you pick a particular topic, it stays a little bit more confined. And that's sort of the challenge of climate change, I guess, overall. It is that it's so complex and it touches so many different sectors. Having said that, because it is so important, we feel it's really, really critical that it's not stuck in ministries of environment, because I think traditionally it has been seen as an environmental issue that ministries of environment lead on within governments. That has really not been very, I would actually say detrimental to climate action, because the ministries of environment tend to be not terribly strong ministries within government. So it really is critical that ministries of finance, ministries of planning, start taking the climate agenda on board and really own it. So that's sort of, again, where we really, really, really want to work with our IMF colleagues. So again, it's a little bit of a complicated picture, and I think it's quite a unique set of issues that is really so cross-cutting compared to many, many of the other issues that, that we've collaborated on in the past.
Now, just conscious of the time, I can't resist asking Michael a question. You said at the beginning that this was an evaluation of the fund side of collaboration, but given that this is an evaluation of collaboration, what are the issues with respect to joint evaluation between the bank and the fund? And do they mirror the problems with bank-fund collaboration?
Yes, good question, Jeff. And the kind of irony of undertaking an evaluation of bank fund collaboration without collaborating with the IG is not lost on us. I mean, I would just say, and you of course are well aware of this, that we did actively and rather heavily reach out to IEG colleagues, yourself in particular, to help us with a lot of the aspects of the evaluation. So we certainly were informally, I think, engaging with our IEG colleagues at various stages in the evaluation. We felt there was a tension, however, between, as I mentioned, this is a pilot of a quicker IEO approach, and it was fairly apparent to us that making it a kind of formally joint evaluation was going to slow things down, and would have been challenging for us to deliver in the time frame. So, in a sense, it's unfortunate that that there was that tension between the subject matter and the importance of IEO moving relatively quickly. Are the challenges? I think, to be honest, and particularly bearing in mind what we've heard from James and Bernice, I can't say honestly that the challenges facing our two evaluation offices to work together could be greater than they are in terms of the actual the policy work that the two institutions are doing, because you know, we certainly should be speaking, for example, there's pretty much the same language, and in a sense the scope of what we're trying to do as an evaluation compared to what Bernice and James are trying to do in terms of changing the world seems rather different orders of magnitude. So I don't think we could plead that this is just intrinsically impossible. Hopefully, you know, the way I think that we have engaged across the two evaluation offices is going to have some spillover benefits, and hopefully will lead to more kind of joint work in the future. And there is already, I think, some talk between our two evaluation offices about the way we're going to think about evaluating the COVID crisis and the response of the two organizations. So there you go.
Okay. Yep, that's terrific. And of course, as we write our time, there's some really interesting questions coming in. One about whether or not the benefits of collaboration actually trickle down to the countries, or are they just for the institutions? But we'll have to put that one aside as I make a very cavalier attempt to wrap up. This is going to be very incomplete, but you know, and shake your head vigorously if you disagree. But I think part of the reason, first of all, we're talking about this is a recognition that climate is much more important than people would have acknowledged even just a few years ago. Having the bank and the fund working on it together gives more points of entry into both vehicles, Article 4 consultations, reaching finance ministries in a way that perhaps the bank is less good at. It's clearly multifaceted, and so nobody's got the whole picture. So having more folks around the table is good. And even if it's, you know, even if we end up doing exactly the same thing, not to say we do, the more people hear this, the better, because it's not the sort of thing that can be neglected much longer. That said, there are obvious complementarities, reinforcing of messages, and it strikes the point that someone made that 3 years from now, we're probably having a very, very different discussion about this and be much further along. So perhaps your evaluation is on the early stages of collaboration. 5 years from now, it'll be much more sophisticated. And I think that puts us 1 minute before the end. Let me give the final minute to Michael and thank the panelists and the organizers. Over to you. 1 minute.
Thank you, Jeff. And let me also thank Bernice and James very much for engaging so wholeheartedly and grappling with the technological challenges. So thank you both very much. I'm come away feeling very optimistic about the prospects for bank fund collaboration in the climate area. So good luck to you both, and you know, we will hopefully be engaging with you more to see if we can help you in your efforts.
Great. Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting.
Thanks, Michael.
Fun.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.